Welcome to another episode of TimeShift America. Where are we off to today as we take a virtual road trip back through time? Let's enter the server room and decipher our latitude and longitude. And today it is a latitude of 45 degrees, 22 minutes and 35 seconds north, with a longitude of 84 degrees, 57 minutes and 22 seconds west. For this time shift lesson, we head up to northern Michigan and the city of Petoskey, a resort town that dates back to the mid-1800s. We're driving along Highway 31 that hugs Lake Michigan along the western side of the state. We're looking out over the little Traverse Bay, that's Harbor Springs off in the distance. We have to slow down here and freeze the frame right there. Let's time shift back to 1890 and explore the history around us as we bring history to life. Where now stands Bayfront Park once stood the Petoskey Dock. It served freighters that would take lumber to Chicago, Milwaukee, and points west, and passenger steamers that would bring tourists and those looking for the reputed health benefits of the town of the million-dollar sunsets. The relative location of Petoskey is within Emmett County, about 300 miles northwest of Detroit in the northwest lower peninsula of Michigan, just a few minutes north of the 45th parallel, which is halfway from the equator to the North Pole. Today, Petoskey is a bustling resort town with a population of about 6,000 people. The city is 85% urban, 15% rural. Tourism makes up the vast majority of the city's income, and visitors from across the Midwest have for generations made a connection with this little town. A little town with a rich history that we shall discuss here. As cities across the Great Lakes such as Detroit, Milwaukee, and Chicago were industrializing in the late 1800s, people were looking for escapes from the loud, crowded, and smog-filled cities, and Petoskey was ideal. Cool, clean breezes brought by the prevailing westerly winds across Lake Michigan convinced the Western Hay Fever Association to call Petoskey home. They even held their yearly conventions in town. This flyer from 1883 promoting the Detroit, Lansing, and Northern Railroad notes,
"Hay fever, asthma, and catarrh sufferers. The climate of northern Michigan affords speedy and permanent relief for your ailments."
Yes, advertising standards were a little more lax back in the 1880s. In another journal of the time it suggested,
"A full, deep inhalation of Petoskey air contains more of cure for the tired or sick than all of the drugs of the pharmacopoeia."
Petoskey was named in honor of an American Indian chief that lived in the area in the 19th century. He was chief of one of the 3 indigenous peoples that lived in this part of North America for thousands of years. In Michigan, the 3 major tribal groups are the Potawatomi, who occupied the southern portion of the state. The Ojibwe, also known as the Chippewa, were primarily on the eastern and central part of the state. And the Odawa, or the Ottawa, who lived on the land in the western side of what is now the state of Michigan. Together, known as the Three Fires Confederacy, they originally lived as hunters, gatherers, farmers, and traders. Today, the Ojibwe are known as the Keepers of Tradition, the Ottawa as the Keepers of Trade, and the Potawatomi as the Keepers of the Fire. Together, all 3 continue to promote their customs and culture. The Ottawa people were very active around the Little Traverse Bay region, and villages such as Middle Village, Cross Village, and Goodhart all still remain to this day. They spent their days hunting, gathering, farming, and trading. In fact, in Algonquin, the word Ottawa means to trade. It was the 1836 Treaty of Washington, an agreement between the United States and representatives of the Ottawa and Chippewa tribes that saw a massive area of Michigan become available for purchase. One of the initial purchasers of some of the parcels of land was the Ottawa chief Petoskey, born in 1787 along the banks of the Kalamazoo River. His parents are said to have seen crepuscular rays of sunlight. This atmospheric phenomenon in Ottawa is called Petoskey, hence his name. Petoskey, son of a French-Canadian fur trader and a native Ottawan mother, he grew up in the lodge of his parents, roughly 7 miles northwest of Harbor Springs, near the site of today's Middle Village. He married a daughter of a native Ottawan chieftain at the age of 21. They remained in the area, and they started a family. After the Treaty of Washington was finalized, Chief Petoskey started working his recently purchased lands around what was then referred to as Bear Creek. The chief was a fur trader, and when the missionaries arrived in the early 1800s, they connected with the chief. The relationships were cordial, and the missionaries gave the chief a first name, a Christian name. That name was Gnaeus. Gnaeus was an abbreviation of Ignatius, after the missionaries' patron Saint Ignatius of Loyola. The high honor was indicative of the respect the missionaries had for the chief. As the area around Bear River steadily grew, the decision was made in 1873 to rename the town Petoskey, in honor of the chief who at the time was 85 years old. Ignatius Petoskey lived another 13 years, passing away at the age of 98. He lived an unusually long time for the period. As the passage of time marched on, the first peoples found themselves going from the majority population to a minority. Many new residents were wary of the indigenous people's culture and social traits. A systematic effort was made to transform their culture. As a result of the work of the missionaries, many Native Americans were welcome to participate in church services. A more extreme example of how the indigenous way of life was forcibly transformed is the case of the Holy Childhood School in Harbor Springs, a federally funded boarding school for Native American children. Such schools were established in the late 1800s, and their curriculum was limited to teach only reading and writing. The goal was to produce not lawyers or doctors or engineers, no, rather menial laborers, and nothing more. At the same time, the school would not allow the children to engage in any Native American culture, going so far as to ban their language, the wearing of their native clothes, a de facto eradication of the Native American culture, a process that affected these children for the rest of their lives. Most of these schools were closed down in the 1920s. The last one still operating was in the town across the bay, in Harbor Springs. It finally closed in 1983. Michigan's population started to rapidly increase during the mid-1800s. The 1830s saw the most dramatic population rise, mainly because of the completion of the Erie Canal in 1825. The canal allowed for cheaper and easier travel westward, as it connected directly to the Great Lakes. Pioneers from the New England states, especially New York, could get to Michigan in a matter of days, as opposed to weeks. Some of the first arrivals from the eastern U.S. in 1833 were missionaries. Initially landing in southeast Michigan, they started moving about the territory, preaching their gospel and attempting to convert the Native Americans to Christianity. At the same time the missionaries were arriving into the territory, so were those looking for what some have come to call green gold. The population of the United States was growing fast, and the demand for construction timber was high, as the supply was rapidly diminishing in the east. By the mid-1800s, most of the old-growth pine forests of eastern U.S. were depleted, and the lumber barons were looking towards northern Michigan and the Petoskey area for logging opportunities to help keep the westward American expansion going. Petoskey and the surrounding forests were in an ideal location to cut, clear, and ship wood across the Great Lakes, back east, and down the Mississippi River. The pioneer settlers of the 1820s found vast expanses of virgin timber. 50 years later, Michigan was the leading lumber producer in the country. The felling of trees initially only took place in the winter months. The snow and ice made moving tons of wood a little simpler. The huge tree trunks would be loaded onto skids, and horse or ox would drag the loaded skids to nearby riverbanks, where they would stay until the springtime thaw. When the rivers started flowing, logs would be floated downstream to mills dotted along the riverbanks and estuaries. The tree trunks would then be milled into usable lumber and loaded onto ships. During the height of logging, nearly every river was choked with logs, resulting in great environmental destruction to the riverbeds, vegetation, and wildlife. When logs jammed the river, dynamite was used to blow them back into motion. Lumber mills dumped massive amounts of sawdust, preventing native fish from spawning. The rampant harvesting of lumber decimated the forests. This chart, plotting Michigan's pine lumber production, clearly shows how rapidly the loggers were able to clear the land, leaving behind a barren wasteland of small trees, broken branches, brush, and tree stumps as far as the eye could see. Tinderboxes ready to become raging wildfires. In October of 1871, Great Lakes wildfires scorched 2.5 million acres of newly deforested land, killing over 2,000 people. The Charleston Daily News reported in September of 1871,
Fire is raging along the coast of Lake Michigan. The loss of property and life will be fearful. The wells are all dried up.
In 1873, Petoskey benefited from two major infrastructure projects. Local entrepreneur Hiram Rose funded the construction of the first dock. In the same year, the Grand Rapids and Indiana Railroad line reached the town, with the track terminating in the harbor. With the dock and railroad in place, raw materials could easily be transported. As logging dried up, a new natural resource was being harvested. That resource? Limestone. The Petoskey Limestone Company, owned by the aforementioned Hiram Rose. With the recent fires on residents' minds, the city of Petoskey decided to start constructing their town of brick and mortar. In fact, one of the hotels, the Perry Hotel, advertised in 1900 as fireproof and boasted steam heat. The scene was now set for Petoskey to become northern Michigan's premier resort destination. Newspapers from around the country had articles and advertisements for elegant steamships at extremely low rates for travel between Chicago and northern Michigan. Add to that, luxurious trains. The Topeka State Journal in Kansas ran an ad that compared Petoskey to the
Bay of Naples, and certainly the climate is superior to that of the famous Italian resort.
With marketing like that, it's understandable why people came in droves. By 1900, Petoskey had 42 dressmakers, 20 grocery stores, 19 taverns, and 14 hotels that could accommodate 2,000 nightly guests, going from small settlement to bustling city in just over 25 years. As the city grew, churches were built and civic organizations sprang up. There were dozens of women's civic organizations, including the Petoskey Federated Women's Club, the Rebecca Lodge, and the Women's Christian Temperance Union, organizations for women and by women, organizations that promoted women's suffrage and their right to vote. The Michigan ladies' efforts paid off when on June 10, 1919, then Michigan Governor Albert E. Sleeper, surrounded by Michigan suffragettes, signed the bill that was part of the ratification process of the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution. Shortly before they received their absolute constitutional rights to vote in 1920, women across the nation were pressed into service on the home front during World War I. The ladies of Petoskey did their civic duty, so much so, it's evident in this hotel guest book that was repurposed as a directory of homes in town and contact information for the ladies in residence. Basically, a local census of hundreds of women living in Petoskey. This information provided to be a valuable resource for both the war effort on the home front, as well as a contact list to easily organize and spread the word about the marches and assemblies protesting for their right to vote. Many ladies of Petoskey were members of the local chapter of the Michigan Equal Suffrage Association. The association would eventually become the Michigan League of Women Voters, an organization that is still active and involved in many political issues to this day. Which brings us back to the Odawa tribe that were the original occupants of the land around Little Traverse Bay. On one hand, places named honoring the Native Americans such as Petoskey, Sheboygan, Mackinac Island, Taos, Pontiac, Owasso, Ottawa, and Chippewa counties, to name a few. On the other hand, treaties and schools designed specifically to erase their culture. It's been a complicated relationship as today we witness the removal of statues of once revered icons of America's history. Christopher Columbus, Robert E. Lee, even George Washington. While some statues from the past come down, others still stand tall. Chief Petoskey, honoring his 98 years of life and his leadership to the area and the Ottawa culture. Perched on a bluff overlooking Little Traverse Bay, we see the blending of cultures, the transformation of people and the land on which they live. In the sunshine filtering through the morning clouds, we recall the chief and his people's way of life, transformed, yet still resilient. The loggers that risk life and limb to build new towns. The missionaries that came to spread Christianity, and the ladies that organized and strengthened their political power. So now, let's time shift back from the late 1800s. Be sure to head over to TimeShiftAmerica.com. Click on the 1890 Petoskey Harbor lesson for further resources, quizzes, assessments, and research material. We're bringing history to life on TimeShift America.